Dry your eyes, dear bairn. The darkness calls us all. You're perfect to go underground, 'cause your body is so small. Your sister and your mother, they soon got used to it. It's just the way things are, son. Our life is down pit. So dry your eyes, dear bairn. There's really nought to fear, apart from being hungry, but that is why we're here. The South Yorkshire village of Silkstone lies in the shadow of the Pennine Hills, between the towns of Barnsley and Penistone. Today it's a place of quiet lanes and green fields, a rural haven with a close-knit community and a history steeped in coal dust. But on a summer's day in the year 1838, this peaceful village bore witness to a tragedy so profound it would echo through the ages. A tragedy that pulled back the curtain on the dark heart of Britain's Industrial Revolution. For it was here, in the depths of the Husker Pit, that 26 children, some as young as 7, lost their lives. Not to fire or explosions, but to water, fear, and the cruel indifference of a system built on their small shoulders. What happened that day forced a nation to look down into the mines and confront the question no one wanted to ask. How many corves of coal is the life of a child worth?
Hello friends and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, I'm Claire and this is the Wanderlust way. Firstly, let me say thank you to everybody that supports this channel by liking, commenting, subscribing and sharing. Everything that you do helps the channel to grow and it allows me to continue bringing you along on adventures like this and sharing with you those stories. So today is going to be a little bit of a difficult one. It is the start of a brand new mini-series. There's going to be 3 episodes in total and we're here in Yorkshire looking into some of the worst pit disasters. Now these are going to be stories that are very, very dark and they are going to be quite disturbing. So I do not bring them to you lightly, and if that's not your sort of content, I suggest you turn away now. But I think they are stories that need to be told and they are important to remember. Now the first story that I'm going to share with you in today's video was brought to my attention after I released the video on Yorkshire's haunted roads, where a viewer got in touch by the name of Darren. Hello Darren, if you're watching. He's an ex-coal miner from South Yorkshire and he let me on to this story.
To recap, in that video about Yorkshire's haunted roads, we explored the chilling legends surrounding the Stocksbridge bypass, including ghostly sightings of children in ragged clothing seen dancing and singing around an old pylon before disappearing into thin air.
You see, what's particularly haunting is that the Stocksbridge bypass and the pylon where those ghostly children were sighted is less than 10 miles from where I'm standing today. And what I'm standing on was once the vast South Yorkshire coalfield.
Around 600 square miles of underground industry, the South Yorkshire coalfield threaded through seams like Barnsley, Silkstone, Parkgate, Thorncliffe and Haigh Moor. The Barnsley seam in particular was one of the most valuable, thick, productive and deadly. So maybe it's no surprise that stories of restless spirits linger around here, because just a short distance from that ghostly pylon, in this quiet village of Silkstone, something very real happened. A tragedy so profound, it would eventually help change the course of history.
Now, despite me being from Yorkshire, despite me having a father-in-law as a coal miner, and despite me loving history, before Darren got in touch with me in the comment section of that video, I had heard nothing about the Husker Pit disaster, and that struck me. How could something so important, the loss of 26 children, simply fade from public memory? Now that's not to say that the local people here do not remember. I am sure there are people that have family connections and ancestors linked to that tragedy. But what about everybody else? Now I have a friend that lives in the next village and there were 3 children from that disaster that lived in that same village, and I asked her the other day, one simple question: have you heard of the Husker Pit disaster? And she said no. And I'm pretty sure that she's not alone in that. The more I looked into it, the more I realised a lot of our mining history has been pushed aside and forgotten. We weren't taught about this in schools. How would people possibly know about it? So what started off as one viewer's message, Darren's message to me, started off this chain of events that had me digging into communities and looking into pit disasters, tragedies that happened not just here in Silkstone but throughout the county.
Coal powered Britain's industrial revolution. It put steam in the engines, fired the furnaces and kept the hearths burning. But that power came at a price, and it's the human cost, the lives underground, the families left behind, that this series is here to remember. Because the veins of Yorkshire run deep with soot, and there's a world beneath our feet we must never forget.
This is the first story in our series, so for today we'll start with the children, and that's enough waffle. Let's wander.
In the early 1800s, coal was the black gold that fueled Britain's rise. It powered steam engines, lit furnaces, and fed the fires of a rapidly expanding Britain. Without coal, there would have been no industrial revolution, no railways, no factories, no steel. And yet the empire it helped build was carved out of darkness not just by men, but by women and children, thousands of them. Here in Silkstone, entire families worked underground. The coal seams that ran beneath their homes, scenes like Barnsley and Silkstone, were narrow, cramped and brutal, but they were also rich. In the 1830s, one of the most powerful coal owners in the region was Robert C. Clark. He ran the Silkstone pits, and at the height of their operation, over 90 children were on his books. 76 of them were hurriers, boys and girls aged 8 to 17, who spent their days dragging heavy corves of coal through tunnels barely big enough to crawl through. Most were strapped into a primitive harness, a leather belt around the waist, attached to a chain between the legs which connected to the corve. They crawled on all fours, scraping knees and hands along rough, uneven floors. Over time their bodies bore the marks, swollen joints, calloused limbs and bald patches from using their heads to push carts uphill. The youngest children worked as trappers, as young as 5 years old. Their job was to sit for 10 to 12 hours a day in a cold hole by a trapdoor, opening it only when they heard a hurrier coming.
Now most of these trappers, they would have sat alone in the dark, no company, no light. Occasionally a kindly miner might drop them in a piece of candle, but for most of the time they were sat there alone, listening perhaps to the scratching of rats and the rumble of the wagon carts as they started approaching their doors. And it's just so sad, sitting there in the dark, in silence, and most likely in fear.
And these passageways weren't just small, they were suffocating. Some were barely 22 inches high, and that's about the size of a drain pipe. Children were often forced to twist and crawl in permanently hunched positions, leading to lifelong deformities and spinal damage. Their working conditions were described in an 1842 report as very oppressive, and yet these mines continued to operate with little oversight. Even outside the pit, the hardship continued. Many of children were too exhausted to walk home, they'd fall asleep at the side of the road, or they'd nod off halfway through their evening meal, with food still in their mouths. Sunday was their day of rest, and for many a day of Sunday school, but teachers often spoke of how the children were too tired to learn, too withdrawn to engage. One observer wrote that the saddest thing of all was their loss of childhood. These weren't playful, giggling youngsters. They were little old men and women in spirit, worn down before their time. And yet this was accepted. It was normal, expected, necessary even, because if your father was a miner and there were mouths to feed, your future was already decided, and it lay somewhere deep beneath the soil.
In the days following Queen Victoria's coronation, Yorkshire had been hot, heavy and airless. And just shortly after
On the 4th of July 1838, the skies over Silkstone finally gave way. Thunder rumbled in the distance, black clouds rolled over the hills like a tide, and by early afternoon the village was in complete darkness, the middle of the day looking more like midnight. What started as a few heavy drops of rain quickly turned into a violent, narrow band of storm. Hailstones shattered glass at nearby estates, roads vanished underwater, gardens were ripped away, outhouses flattened, and Silkstone became a sea of flood and debris. Underground in the Moor End and Husker Pits, around 80 people were still at work, men, women and children. When water began pouring down the shaft, someone raised concerns. An order was shouted to get everyone to the surface. But by that point, the storm had damaged the winding gear, and so the machine that would usually lift workers back to the top could no longer be used. Those working underground would have to be pulled manually back to the surface, but this would take time, and the children waiting in the cramped underbelly of the earth for their escape were starting to panic. Inside the tunnels, in near total darkness, a rumour began to spread. There must have been an explosion. Miners were told to extinguish their candles in case of fire damp, and the whole pit was plunged into blackness. Amid the confusion, someone suggested an alternative way out, the day hole, a sloping drift entrance higher up in Nabbs Wood. It was a steep climb, but if they could reach it, they could walk out into daylight. Around 40 children, mainly hurriers and trappers, began to make their way toward the exit.
Here in Nabbs Wood, we're on what is the other side of that day hole. So underneath us, the children will have been clambering through the dark, feeling with their tiny hands against the wall for the drift and the exit that would lead them to safety. But unfortunately, unbeknown to them, the dried stream that was just a trickle when they first started their shift had now become a raging torrent or a river. And it wasn't until they'd passed through the first trapdoor and started approaching the drift that some of them will have heard the gurgling of water. Now, the reports suggest that some of them hid in some of the slits in the walls that had been created by the coal that had been cut out, because there were about 40 children in total that ran towards the day hole. The rest of them, obviously not so lucky, the water came towards them, and as it did, tumbled them together and held them against that trapdoor that they'd just come through. Too much water, too many people, too dark, too dangerous. And this is where we are.
Some of the older kids had made it most of the way up. 14 of them managed to climb through those slits in the walls, and a few had even turned back, but the rest, they didn't stand a chance. The water burst into the passage and swept everything with it. When rescuers finally reached them, 26 children had drowned. They were found piled together as if still clinging to each other. The youngest was just 7 years old.
Now, when I started looking into the Husker Pit disaster, one of the books that I was recommended to read was Victoria's Children of the Dark by Alan Gallop. And if you are interested in the story, then I can highly recommend reading this book. Now, I'm going to read an extract from this book that tells you what happened when the adults finally got to the day hole after the water had subsided and they retraced the children's footsteps. After the water had subsided on the other side, the trapdoor was fully swung open to reveal the tragic sight of bruised, twisted, tangled and bloated children's bodies assembled in an undignified and soaking pile. It must have taken an eternity to untangle the bodies of 15 boys and 11 girls, 10 of them under the age of 11. It appeared as if they were still clinging to each other for support, reassurance and deliverance from their terrible fate. Their ages ranged from 7 to 17 years of age, 20 of them from Silkstone. Two brothers, Isaac and Abraham Wright, aged 12 and 8, were found separate from the rest, locked in death in each other's arms. Their father had died after a fire damp explosion at the Moor End pit the previous year, and the brothers were the main supporters of their mother Mary. Now they too were gone. Each individual body, covered in mud and dirt, was extracted from the tangled pile, carried to the bottom of the Moor End shaft and hoisted up to the surface, where a silent crowd of anxious parents, brothers, sisters and neighbours from the township had begun to gather in the mud and hailstones which had settled on the ground. We're entering Nabbs Wood now, which we've come in off Moor End Lane, and this is the site of the memorial, which I will show you just literally right in front of me. So this is it. Now you could obviously see it by the roadside if you are walking past, perhaps not if you were driving past. When you approach the memorial, there is a plaque outside, gives you a little bit more information. Here we've got where we've left the car, we've got the memorial here, and then it's up this little path towards the site of the original day hole. This is the memorial to the Husker Pit disaster here in Nabbs Wood. Now you'll see inside we've got two children. They were hurriers carved out of sandstone, alone in their cramped passageways. Now there is a really sad story about these figures because not long after the memorial was built, they were actually stolen. And as luck would have it, they were actually found later on in a skip in Stocksbridge, and somebody found them, brought them back here. One of the heads was missing, but they were restored and they were put back in their rightful place here in Nabbs Wood. Now this isn't the original site of the day hole, that's further up in the woods, but they decided to build the memorial here so that it was closer to the roadside so that people would see it hopefully as they were passing by. Now there is an inscription to the memorial. This monument was erected by the people of Silkstone parish in 1988 to mark the 150th anniversary of the tragic event on the 4th of July 1838 when 26 children were drowned in the Husker Pit close to this place. And if you get closer, you'll see that this is actually etched onto what is supposed to look like a trapdoor.
The tragedy at Husker Pit did not just touch Silkstone, it consumed it. Not a street, not a row of cottages, not a single corner of this small mining village was left untouched. It was as if some unseen hand had swept through, leaving a kiss of death upon so many homes. Now here in Silkstone is the All Saints Church, where you will find the grave of those children that were buried in the disaster. And this church is older than the disaster, so it is where those funeral services will most probably have took place. Each child was carried first to an outhouse on the edge of the colliery. There their faces were gently cleaned, the mud, coal dust and debris washed away by volunteers. Some were members of Robert C. Clark's staff, others were simply neighbours doing what little they could. Then one by one the carts moved through the village, a slow procession of grief.
We are now at the monument and the grave site for those children. So I'll just read the words that are inscribed on this monument. This monument was erected to perpetuate the remembrance of an awful violation of the Almighty, which took place in this parish on the 4th day of July 1838. On that eventful day, the Lord sent forth his thunder, lightning, hail and rain, carrying devastation before them. And by a sudden eruption of water into the coal pits of R.C. Clark Esquire, 26 human beings, whose names are recorded here, were suddenly summoned to appear before their Maker. Reader, remember, every neglected call of God will appear against thee at the day of judgment. Let this solemn warning then sink deep into thy hearts, and so prepare thee that the Lord, when he cometh, may find thee watching. That's deep. Right, the boys were buried separately to the girls in graves. So we're going to go and look at the boys' names first. Now on this side, we've got the the mortal remains are deposited in the graves as undernamed. First grave, beginning at the north end, George Birkinshaw, aged 10, Joseph Birkinshaw, aged 7, now they were brothers. Isaac Wright, aged 12, Abraham Wright, aged 8, again brothers. In the second grave, you've got James Clarkson, aged 16, Francis Hoyland, aged 13, William Attic, aged 12, and Samuel Horn, aged 10. In the third grave, Eli Hutchinson, aged 9, George Garnett, aged 9, John Simpson, aged 9. And in the fourth grave, George Lamb, aged 8, William Womerfley, aged 8, James Turton, aged 10, and John Gothard, aged 8. But we've not finished because the girls are on the other side. I think when you read the names, it just makes you... The mortal remains of the females are deposited in the graves at the feet of the males as undernamed. The first grave, beginning at the south end, Catherine Garnett, aged 11, Hannah Webster, aged 13, Elizabeth Carr, aged 13, Anne Moss, aged 9. Second grave, Elizabeth Hollings, aged 15, Ellen Parker, aged 15, Hannah Taylor, aged 17. Third grave, Mary Sellers, aged 10, Elizabeth Clarkson, aged 11. She lies at the feet of her brother, James Clarkson, Sarah Newton, aged 8, and Sarah Dukes, aged 10. Standing here in All Saints Church in the churchyard next to the memorial and grave of the children, it is impossible not to feel the enormity of it all. 26 little lives lost. And this is lovely and it's really neat and orderly, but the loss was anything but. And on Saturday, the 7th of July, shortly after those deaths, the village of Silkstone came together, the community gathered together for the funeral of those little children. And it was here, they say, over 20,000 people came.
In total, 7 graves were dug, 4 for the boys, 3 for the girls, and the boys' coffins were placed in a row, 4 in each of 3 graves and 3 in the last. The girls were laid at their feet, 4 in one grave, 4 in another, and 3 in the final resting place. They were buried not as statistics, but as sons, daughters, siblings, friends. And yet, in the newspapers and in society, they were still often referred to as hurriers and trappers, not children, not individuals. The Northern Star reported, Silkstone had never, perhaps in the whole period of its history, been the theatre of such melancholy a spectacle. But for the people who lived through this was no spectacle. It was life, stopped in its tracks. Now, if you come inside the St James Chapel in Silkstone Church, All Saints Church, you'll find a stained glass window which was commissioned by the village. They did lots of fundraising, we've been told, to create enough money to have this window made, and it is in memory of obviously the Husker Pit disaster victims. So you'll see at the top we've got the stars, 26 stars, which represent the 26 children that were killed in that accident. You've then got the weather, the lightning bolts, and the gush of water that came down. Underneath that, you've got the black and the amber, which is the coal seam. And then under that, you've got the props that were propping it up and the gushes of water. And it's been done in a colouring book sort of style, because that's what was it, the children, to be more representative of the children. Now, in the flood at the bottom is all the children's names, and inside each name you'll find a number, and that number represents their age. Important piece in this church, and just shows you how important it is for the people in Silkstone to remember every day when they come in this church what happened. The disaster at Huskar Pit sent ripples far beyond the tight-knit community of Silkstone. For once, news didn't stay buried in Yorkshire. It travelled, it crossed counties, it reached London. And there, as people sat beside coal fires warming their hands, they read, perhaps for the first time, of the world beneath their comfort, of children not in school but underground, not playing but labouring in tunnels no taller than a drain. Even the young Queen Victoria, just 19 at the time, was said to have taken notice. It sparked a royal commission led by Anthony Ashley Cooper, a man horrified by what he found in the underbelly of industrial Britain. From their investigation came the Mines and Collieries Act of 1842, the first law to ban women and girls and boys under the age of 10 from working in underground mines. It was a moment of reform, but it wasn't greeted with universal applause. For many families already scraping by, the change brought fear. If the children could no longer work, how would the rent be paid? What would happen when the coal kings came knocking? Because that was the trouble with Yorkshire. Its coal seams were rich, deep and plentiful, and the men who owned them were wealthier still, determined to keep the black gold flowing, no matter who had to crawl through the darkness to get it.
Life as a mining child was really hard. I mean, most of these children, they were completely illiterate. 6 days a week they might be down there in the mines, in the dark. And when you think back to your own childhood, 6, 7 years old, those are the times when you are most afraid of the dark. And yet down there they were in the underbelly of the earth, toiling in the darkness in dangerous, cramped situations, and most of the time all alone. And this wasn't a choice for these children. This was a circle of life, bound by soot and debt and sacrifice.
And so we must ask ourselves, at what cost is coal worth its weight? How many souls does it take to keep the fires of industry burning? Silkstone gave us 26 reasons to ask these questions, but this was not the end. Just a few miles from here, another disaster would come. More lives would be lost. And so in the next episode, we'll continue to unearth what lies beneath and discover the true cost of coal.
Thank you for joining me in one of the stories of one of Yorkshire's darkest days. I know it wasn't an easy story to listen to, because it certainly wasn't an easy story to tell. But these children, they mattered. Their lives were short, but their legacies were long. And I hope we can remember them not as victims, but as voices for change. There are more stories like this buried in Britain's coalfields. Stories of courage, sacrifice and communities that gave everything to allow this country to grow. This channel, we will continue to uncover them one story at a time. Until next time, take care, and thank you truly for remembering them all with me.